Life in suburban Los Angeles had always felt like an endless loop. Every morning, I'd sit on my porch with a cup of chamomile tea, a quiet ritual I had kept ever since my husband, Leo, passed away. He used to joke that I was more committed to my tea than to anything else. 5 years had passed since he was gone, and my world had shrunk to the size of my backyard garden, a dusty bookshelf, and the occasional small talk with neighbors about the weather. But then everything changed. Suddenly. All at once. It started with a jarring noise, the garbage truck slamming the bins down onto the curb. I flinched, pulling my cardigan tighter around my shoulders, when I saw Mark Wilson stepping out of the house across the street. Mid-40s, broad-shouldered, carrying himself with an effortless confidence that made people take notice. He was dressed casually, button-down shirt, jeans, moving with purpose, yet his expression was distant, as if his mind were miles away. I had seen him 100 times before, but this time, something about him caught my eye. Before I could dwell on it, the sound of screeching tires snapped my focus back to the street. A delivery van had barely avoided a cyclist. My heart pounded as the two men exchanged sharp words. This kind of drama was rare in our quiet neighborhood, and it wasn't just me who noticed. Mark had stepped onto his lawn, his brows furrowed, watching the scene unfold. "Crazy out here today, huh?" His voice carried easily as he glanced in my direction. "I was just thinking the same," I replied, offering a small smile. Before I could say more, a knock echoed from my front door. My stomach tightened. Visitors were a rarity. Mark tilted his head. "Expecting someone?" "No," I hesitated before opening the door. Standing there was a delivery man in uniform, holding a small package. "Delivery for Anna Holt." "That's me, but I didn't order anything." "Probably a mix-up," Mark chimed in, now standing closer. "Mind if I take a look?" The courier scrolled through his device while Mark examined the label. "It's not yours," he confirmed, handing it back with a half-smile. The courier apologized and left, but Mark lingered. There was something unspoken between us, something pressing in the air. Speaking of unexpected things, his voice had softened. "Can we talk?" Curiosity flickered inside me. "Of course."
Come in.
Inside, Mark paced my living room, hands on his hips, like he was searching for the right words. "It's about my sister, Claire," he finally said. "She's staying with me for a while, going through a divorce." "It's messy, Anna. Really messy." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, motioning for him to sit. He remained standing, his gaze drifting toward the window. "I don't know how to help her. She's always been the strong one, but now it's like she's unraveling." His words were heavy with concern. "You've been through so much," he added, turning toward me. "Losing Leo, rebuilding your life, you're resilient. I think you could help her."
Talk to her.
"Show her that there's life beyond heartbreak." His request caught me off guard.
Me?
"I don't know if I." "You're exactly the right person," he cut in, his voice steady. "You've found a way to keep going. She needs to see that's possible." The raw sincerity in his voice sent a ripple through me. For a man who always seemed composed, this moment of vulnerability was unexpected. "Okay," I said after a long pause. "If you think it'll help, I'll try." Relief washed over his face. He started to thank me, but a piercing car alarm blared outside. "What now?" he muttered, peering through the window. Down the street, a runaway dog had triggered the alarm, sending its owner into a frantic chase. Mark chuckled. "Feels like the universe is restless today." "It does," I agreed, but my thoughts were elsewhere. Later that evening, after we had settled the details about Claire's visit, I stood on my porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Across the lawn, Mark lingered near his doorway, silhouetted by the last traces of daylight. He gave a small wave before stepping inside. For the first time in years, something stirred inside me. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was something real. Something alive. And just like that, the quiet life I had built around me started to crack open. It started with quick visits, Mark stopping by to finalize details about Claire's visit. At first, the conversations were practical. What days worked best, whether Claire preferred tea or coffee, what kind of books she liked. But as the days unfolded, those quick visits stretched longer. Minutes turned into hours. Talks shifted from logistics to personal stories, to shared laughter, to the kind of easy companionship I hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, Mark showed up unannounced, holding a small pot of lavender. "Thought this might brighten up the place," he said, setting it down on my porch railing with a sheepish smile. I raised an eyebrow. "So, we're decorating now." "Maybe," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Claire used to grow these in her garden. I thought it might make her feel more at home." There it was again, that quiet thoughtfulness that seemed stitched into his every action. It was hard not to admire. We sat on the porch that day, the warm air carrying the scent of lavender between us. And for the first time, Mark talked about himself. About his career in real estate. His dream of starting his own boutique firm one day. How, once, on a whim, he'd driven cross-country just to watch the Grand Canyon at sunrise. But not everything was lighthearted. "She's not herself anymore," he admitted, staring at the horizon. "Claire was always the strong one. Now she won't even look me in the eye some days." I set my cup down. "You're doing everything you can, Mark. Sometimes just being there is enough." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and something in his expression shifted. "Sometimes, Anna," he murmured, "I think you understand me better than anyone I've ever met."
I should have said something.
Should have looked away. But I didn't. And neither did he. By the time Claire arrived that weekend, I felt like I already knew her. She was younger than I'd expected, with tired eyes and the kind of fragile demeanor that told me she had been holding herself together by sheer will. The first thing she said to me was hesitant, almost apologetic. "Mark said you were kind," she murmured as I ushered her inside. I wasn't sure I believed him, but I think he's right. We spent the afternoon in the garden. She ran her fingers over the lavender Mark had brought, her shoulders relaxing just a little. We talked about everything and nothing, books, the small absurdities of life, the mess of her divorce. As the sun dipped lower, Claire leaned back in her chair with a sigh. "It's been so long since I felt normal," she admitted. Then, looking at me, her voice softened. "Thank you, Anna, for listening, for making me feel like I'm not completely broken." Her gratitude was genuine. But as Mark arrived to check on her, I couldn't help but notice the way his attention lingered, not just on her. On me. That evening, after Claire went to bed, Mark stayed behind on the porch. The air had cooled, carrying the scent of lavender and cut grass. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the distant hum of the city. "Claire seems lighter," he said eventually. "She's finding her way," I replied. "She just needs time. And people who remind her she's not alone." He turned to me, his gaze unreadable. "You're good at that," he said. "Making people feel like they're not alone." For a moment, the world felt small. Just the two of us, sitting there, our words hanging heavy in the quiet air. I felt my pulse quicken. "Mark,
But he smiled then.
A small, wistful smile. "Good night, Anna." And just like that, the moment slipped away. I watched as he disappeared into the night. And I wondered if I had just imagined what I thought was there between us. Or if something had already begun. The following week, Mark kept coming by. Always with a reason, checking in on Claire, dropping off fresh produce from the farmer's market, asking if I needed help fixing the latch on my garden gate. But something about these visits felt different. He lingered longer. His tone was lighter. He laughed more easily. And when he looked at me, I felt it. Something unspoken stretching between us, delicate but undeniable. One evening, he arrived with a bottle of wine in hand. "I thought you might enjoy this," he said, holding it up like an offering. I crossed my arms. And what are we celebrating? He hesitated, then shrugged. Let's call it a thank you for everything you're doing for Claire. The way he said it, though, made my breath catch. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something more. We opened the bottle and settled into the living room, the golden light of dusk filtering through the windows. The conversation wandered, as it always did, from light-hearted stories to deeper confessions. I need to tell you something, Mark said suddenly, his voice quieter now. I looked up. What is it? He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. These visits, they aren't just about Claire. The air between us stilled. My heart gave an unsteady thud. At first, that's what I told myself, he admitted, meeting my gaze with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. But the truth is, I keep coming back because of you, Anna. I blinked, the words landing with the weight of a sudden storm. Me? He nodded, leaning forward slightly. You're incredible.
Strong.
Funny. Every time I'm around you, I feel like I can breathe again. Like the world isn't so heavy. I swallowed hard. A mix of emotions flooded through me, shock, confusion, and something warm and fluttering that I hadn't felt in years. Mark, my voice faltered. He spoke quickly, as though afraid I might stop him. I know this might be out of line, and I know it's unexpected, but I had to tell you, because if I didn't... The sound of footsteps interrupted him. Claire appeared in the doorway, her expression surprised but unreadable. Oh, sorry, she said, glancing between us. I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted some tea. The moment shattered. Mark leaned back, clearing his throat.
No.
You're fine, Claire. We were just talking. She nodded slowly before heading into the kitchen, leaving a trail of silence behind her. I avoided Mark's gaze, my thoughts spinning. After a moment, he stood, his hands on his hips. I should go, he said softly. Mark. He turned, his eyes locking onto mine one last time. Good night, Anna. And then he was gone, leaving me alone with the weight of his confession and the realization that my heart was racing in a way I hadn't let it in far too long. The invitation to dinner came a few days after Mark's confession. I wasn't sure if it was meant to be an olive branch or something more, but the moment I sent the message, come over tonight, I'm making roasted chicken, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. By the time he arrived, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the porch. He stood at the door with a bottle of Pinot Noir in one hand and a bouquet of daisies in the other. I wasn't sure what flowers you liked, he said, offering them with a small, almost shy smile. I took them, feeling the warmth of his fingers brush against mine. They're perfect. There was something different about him that night. A carefulness in the way he moved, a hesitance in his voice, as though he was measuring every word before speaking. We set the table together. Nothing elaborate, just soft candlelight and simple plates. But the atmosphere felt charged in a way I hadn't anticipated. At first, the conversation was easy. Talk of Claire, the latest ridiculous neighborhood drama, something about Mrs. Carter's missing garden gnome, and his recent attempts at cooking. But as the meals stretched on, the space between us seemed to shrink. At one point, Mark set his fork down, his fingers tracing the rim of his wine glass. There's something about nights like this, he said, voice quieter now. They remind me of how life used to feel before everything got complicated. I tilted my head. What do you mean? He hesitated, then took a slow sip of wine. I mean, I never thought I'd feel this way again. Happy. Or even close to it. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. For a man who always seemed composed, this openness was new. I know what you mean, I admitted. For a long time after Leo passed, I told myself that this quiet, simple life was all I could ever have, that I shouldn't expect anything more. Mark's gaze softened. And do you still feel that way? I hesitated. The answer was caught somewhere between my heart and my throat. I don't know, I finally said. But sometimes I think maybe it's not too late to feel something more. He leaned forward, setting his glass down as his eyes locked onto mine. It's not, he said, voice steady. It's never too late, Anna. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with something unspoken. And then, without thinking, I reached across the table, my fingers brushing against his. The touch was brief, barely more than a whisper of skin against skin. But it sent a wave of warmth through me. Mark exhaled, his jaw tightening slightly as though he was stopping himself from saying something. Anna. Before he could finish, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Claire appeared in the doorway, her eyes widening slightly as she took in the scene. Oh, she said, clearly caught off guard. I didn't mean to interrupt. I pulled my hand back, heat rushing to my face. Mark quickly straightened, his expression unreadable. No, you're fine, Claire. We were just talking. I finished, my voice too light, too forced. Claire gave us both a small smile before heading to the kitchen, leaving a trail of silence in her wake. Mark cleared his throat, standing up. I should probably head out. I followed him to the door, my mind racing. There was too much left unsaid, too many emotions humming beneath the surface. As he stepped onto the porch, he turned back, his expression softer now. Good night, Anna. Good night, I whispered, watching as he disappeared into the night. I closed the door and pressed a hand to my chest, feeling the rapid beat of my own heart. Something had shifted between us. Something undeniable. And despite the uncertainty, I couldn't help but wonder, what happens now? I couldn't sleep after that dinner. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mark's hand brushing against mine, his eyes steady, searching, the way his voice softened when he said, It's never too late, Anna. But was it? The next morning, I stood by the window, a cup of tea cradled between my hands, watching the neighborhood come alive. Birds flitted between the trees, a jogger passed by, and Mrs. Hargrove walked her yapping terrier. It was all so familiar, so normal, but inside, I felt like I was standing on the edge of something vast and uncertain. For years, I'd kept my heart in a box, locked up tight with memories of Leo. It wasn't perfect, but it was safe. And now, Mark had come along and shaken everything loose. I spent the day trying to focus on mundane tasks, pulling weeds in the garden, reorganizing the pantry, but my thoughts kept drifting back to him. By the time the sun began to set, I knew I couldn't keep avoiding the questions swirling in my mind. Later that evening, as I stood on the porch watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink, a familiar voice called out, Hey, Anna. I turned to see Mark standing at the edge of my yard, hands shoved into his jacket pockets. He looked hesitant, almost shy, a far cry from the confident man I thought I knew. Hi, Mark, I said, my voice soft. Everything okay? I was wondering if you'd like to go for a walk, he said, nodding toward the quiet street. It's a beautiful evening. I hesitated for a moment before nodding. Let me grab my jacket. We walked in silence at first, the sound of our footsteps filling the space between us. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of jasmine, and the distant hum of the city felt miles away. Eventually, Mark broke the silence. I've been thinking a lot about what I said the other night. At dinner. I glanced at him, my heart skipping a beat. Oh. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. I meant it, Anna. Every word. These past few weeks spending time with you, it's made me realize things about myself. About what I want. His words hung in the air, and I felt my pulse quicken. Mark, He stopped walking then, turning to face me. His expression was raw, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. I love you, Anna. The world tilted. His words landed with the weight of 1,000 questions. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My chest felt tight, my thoughts a tangled mess of doubt and longing. Mark, I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can, He stepped closer, his hands moving slightly, as if he wanted to reach for me, but wasn't sure if he should. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "I just needed you to know." We stood there under the soft glow of a street lamp, the night wrapping around us like a blanket. I could feel the warmth of his presence, the sincerity in his words, and the quiet hope in his eyes. But I also felt the weight of my own fear, the fear of opening my heart again, of risking the pain I'd spent so many years burying. "I need time," I whispered, my voice trembling. Mark nodded, his expression understanding but tinged with sadness. "Take all the time you need, Anna. I'm not going anywhere." As we continued our walk back to the house, the silence between us felt different, heavier, yet filled with possibilities. When we reached my porch, Mark paused at the bottom of the steps. "Good night, Anna," he said softly. "Good night, Mark," I replied, watching as he walked away, his figure disappearing into the shadows. I stood there long after he was gone, the weight of his confession settling over me like a storm cloud. And as I looked out into the quiet night, one question echoed louder than all the others. Was I brave enough to let him in? It had been days since Mark's confession, and his words still played on a loop in my mind. "I love you, Anna." How could 3 simple words feel so heavy, so life-altering? Every time I replayed the moment, my heart raced, but so did my doubts. What if I wasn't ready? What if I never would be? But as I stood in the kitchen, staring at the text message I'd just sent inviting him to dinner, I realized there was no turning back. By the time Mark arrived, the sun was dipping low, casting a warm, golden light over the porch. He stood at the door with a bottle of wine in one hand and a bouquet of daisies in the other. "I wasn't sure if these were your favorite," he said, a shy smile tugging at his lips. "They're perfect," I replied, taking the flowers and stepping aside to let him in. The atmosphere felt charged from the start, our movements careful, our words layered with unspoken meaning. The dinner table was set simply, but the flickering candlelight made it feel more intimate than I'd intended. As we ate, the conversation drifted from Claire's progress to our shared memories of the neighborhood, to the little quirks that made us laugh. But beneath it all, there was a quiet tension, a sense that we were both waiting for the inevitable. At one point, Mark set his fork down and leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on me. "You've been quiet tonight," he said softly. "What's on your mind?" I hesitated, my fingers brushing the rim of my glass. "A lot, honestly. About us. About what you said the other night." He straightened slightly, his expression cautious but hopeful. And I took a deep breath, the words catching in my throat. "And I'm scared, Mark. But I'm also tired of being scared. I don't know what the future looks like, but I don't want to let that stop me anymore." His gaze softened, and the faintest smile appeared on his face. "You have no idea how much it means to hear you say that." We cleared the table together, our movements easy, almost instinctive. But as we stood side by side at the sink, the distance between us seemed to vanish. When the last dish was put away, Mark turned to me, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was electric, and for a moment, neither of us moved. "Anna," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Before I could think, before I could second-guess myself, I closed the gap between us. His lips met mine, tentative at first, then deepening as the world seemed to fall away. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was steady, certain, and filled with everything we hadn't said. When we finally pulled apart, I could feel my cheeks flush, and I avoided his gaze, embarrassed by my own boldness. But Mark didn't move away. "I've wanted to do that for a long time," he admitted, his voice low. "Me too," I said, my heart pounding. But before we could savor the moment, a shadow flickered outside the window. My breath caught as I turned to see Mrs. Hargrove, the neighborhood's most notorious gossip, walking her dog past the house. She glanced toward the window, her steps slowing just enough to make my stomach sink. Mark followed my gaze, his brow furrowing. What's wrong? Mrs. Hargrove, I said, my voice tight. If she saw us. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. So, what if she did? Anna, we're not doing anything wrong. I know, I said, my chest tightening. But this neighborhood, people talk, Mark. And I'm not sure I'm ready to be the subject of their whispers. He took a step closer, his hands gently resting on my shoulders. Let them talk, he said firmly. I don't care about them. I care about you. His words steadied me, but the fear lingered. As I walked him to the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that the evening had been perfect and fragile all at once, like a delicate thread that could unravel with the slightest pull. Good night, Anna, Mark said, his voice soft but sure. Good night, I replied, watching him disappear into the night. As I closed the door, my thoughts raced. The kiss had changed everything. But in our little neighborhood, where every glance and whisper carried weight, I couldn't help but wonder, had we crossed a line we couldn't uncross? It didn't take long for the whispers to start. I could feel them even before I heard them. The sideways glances at the grocery store, the sudden pauses in conversation when I walked into the room. In a neighborhood as tight-knit as ours, privacy was a fleeting luxury, and Mark and I had unwittingly become the newest topic of discussion. It started innocently enough. Mr. Carter, with his ever-present rake, made a passing comment as I walked past his yard one morning. You've been looking happier lately, Anna, he said, his tone almost teasing. I wonder why that is. I forced a smile, brushing it off, but the unease followed me home. By the time I ran into Mrs. Hargrove at the coffee shop 2 days later, the undertones were impossible to ignore. Lovely weather we're having, isn't it? She said, stirring her tea with exaggerated nonchalance. I saw Mark leaving your house the other night. You two must be quite close. There it was. The veiled judgment, the knowing smirk. My stomach twisted as I mumbled something vague and hurried out, her eyes burning into my back. The next day, Mark showed up at my door, his usual warm smile dimmed by concern. Anna, we need to talk, he said as I let him in. He sat on the edge of the couch, his elbows resting on his knees. I heard from Claire, he began, his voice steady but tense. She said someone asked her outright if we were seeing each other. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as his words settled over me. And what did she say? She told them it wasn't anyone's business, he replied, looking up at me. But Anna, this is getting out of hand. People are watching us, talking about us. I know, I said, sinking into the chair across from him. I can feel it everywhere I go. It's like they're waiting for me to trip, to confirm whatever they think they know. Mark leaned forward, his expression earnest. So, what if they know? Anna, we haven't done anything wrong. We're two adults who care about each other. Why does it matter what they think? I opened my mouth to respond, but the words stuck. Why did it matter? Was it because I'd spent years crafting a quiet, respectable life after Leo's death? Or was it because the idea of being judged, of being the subject of endless gossip, terrified me? Before I could answer, there was a knock at the door. Mark and I exchanged a glance, the tension between us sharpening. When I opened the door, I found Mr. Carter standing there, his expression unreadable. Sorry to bother you, he said, glancing past me into the house. But I thought you should know people are talking. And not kindly. I swallowed hard, gripping the doorknob. I appreciate your concern, but it's really not anyone's business, is it? Mr. Carter sighed. Anna, you know how this neighborhood is. People notice things. And they make their own assumptions. Just be careful. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving behind a silence heavier than I could bear. I closed the door, pressing my back against it as I exhaled. Mark stood, his jaw tightening. This is ridiculous, he muttered. I don't want to hide how I feel about you, Anna. But I also don't want this to make your life harder. I looked at him, my heart pounding. What are you saying? I'm saying we need to decide what we're doing. Together. His words settled over me like a challenge, like a lifeline. I had spent so long letting life happen to me, retreating into the safety of solitude. But Mark was asking me to choose, to step forward, to claim what I wanted, despite the consequences. And for the first time in years, I realized I wanted to. I wanted him. I stepped closer, my fingers brushing against his. I don't care what they say, I whispered. I care about you. Relief washed over his face, and just like that, the tension between us unraveled. For better or worse, we had crossed the line, and there was no going back. I told myself I was ready, that I didn't care about the whispers, the stares, the sideways glances at the farmer's market. But it was one thing to say it and another to live it. At first, it was manageable. Mark and I continued as we always had, late-night conversations on my porch, morning coffee runs that stretched into lazy afternoons. But the air between us had shifted. There was no more uncertainty, no more hesitation. Then one evening reality came knocking. I was at the grocery store, absently picking through tomatoes, when I heard it. They never looked at each other like that before, did they? I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Mrs. Hargrove. I suppose widows get lonely, another voice chimed in. I forced myself to keep breathing, to keep moving, but my hands tightened around the tomato in my palm until it nearly burst. It didn't stop there. That weekend, at Claire's insistence, Mark and I joined her for lunch at a small cafe on the other side of town. I had almost convinced myself that, away from our neighborhood, we could just be us. But the moment we stepped inside, I saw it. The way people's gazes flickered toward us. The quick exchanges of hushed words behind napkins and coffee cups. Even Claire noticed. She set down her menu and exhaled. You two aren't exactly low profile these days. Mark tensed beside me. So what? Claire arched an eyebrow. So it's one thing for people to talk, Mark. It's another for them to start making assumptions. And what exactly are they assuming? His voice was calm, but I could hear the frustration simmering beneath it. Claire hesitated, then looked at me. That you were seeing each other before Leo passed. I felt the air leave my lungs. That's ridiculous, Mark said sharply. I know that, Claire said, holding up a hand. But that's what they're saying. That you two were always a little too close. That maybe Leo never knew. I had never wanted to disappear so badly in my life. I placed my hands on the table, willing them to stop shaking. That's not true. Claire's gaze softened. I know, Anna. But in a town like ours, the truth doesn't matter nearly as much as a good story. I didn't realize I was gripping the edge of the table until Mark's hand found mine beneath it. Do you want to leave? He asked quietly. I shook my head.
No.
I was done running. I lifted my chin, met Claire's gaze head-on. Let them talk. For a moment, she just looked at me. Then she smiled. Good, she said. Because if this is what you want, you're going to have to fight for it. I glanced at Mark, whose fingers were still curled around mine, strong and steady. I know, I murmured. And I will. That night, back at my house, Mark and I sat on the porch, a quiet breeze swirling around us. You really don't care? He asked, watching me. I turned to him, taking in the lines of his face, the warmth in his eyes. Of course I care, I admitted. But I care about you more. A slow smile spread across his lips. That's good to hear. And then he kissed me, right there in the open, beneath the glow of the porch light, where anyone could see. Let them talk. The rumors didn't stop. If anything, they only grew. But I no longer flinched when I walked into a room and felt the weight of people's eyes. I no longer cared what they whispered behind cupped hands. Because Mark was beside me. And that was enough. Or at least I thought it was. It was a Friday evening, and he had invited me to his place for dinner, his first attempt at cooking for me. I found him in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, a glass of wine half full on the counter as he stirred a simmering pan. I leaned against the doorway, watching him. I have to say, I'm impressed, I teased. I didn't know you had this in you. He smirked but didn't turn around. Stick around. You might find I have a few more surprises. Something in his tone sent a warm flush through me. He plated the food, simple but perfect, and we ate by candlelight, the conversation easy, the silences comfortable. Then, as I was reaching for my wine glass, Mark set his hand over mine. There's something I've been wanting to tell you, he said. My breath hitched. Mark. He shook his head. Let me say it. I nodded, my pulse quickening. He exhaled, as if steadying himself. I don't just love you, Anna. I want. A loud knock at the door cut through the moment. We both turned. Mark frowned. Who the hell? The knock came again, harder this time.
Urgent.
I stood as Mark moved toward the door, something uneasy settling in my stomach. The moment he pulled it open, I knew. Claire stood on the doorstep, her face pale, eyes wide with something that sent a chill through me. Claire? Mark asked, stepping forward. What's? She barely looked at him. Her gaze locked onto mine instead. Anna, she breathed. You need to come with me. Right now. My stomach dropped. What happened? I whispered. She swallowed hard. Then, after a pause, she said something that made the floor shift beneath me. Something that changed everything. Something I never saw coming.